Hello guys, Mojdal here. In this video, we'll be going over a lot of old removed class abilities from the development of Vanilla or Classic World of Warcraft. We are talking about abilities that exist in the game files, and in some cases they are used by different NPCs in the game, but they appear to have been intended for player use originally. I realize that similar videos have been done by other people, but there are so many interesting spells totally worthy of a video that have not been covered yet. You might recognize some of the names on the list, but I personally didn't know most of them before doing research for the video. If you want to jump straight ahead and skip the rest of the introduction, you can find timestamps to the main abilities in the description. I have decided to classify the abilities into different categories based on their type. In order of the video, the categories will be crowd control, damaging abilities, and buffs and debuffs. The structure will not be that rigid, and if it makes sense to cross-reference different spells while we go, I'll be doing that. Most of the classes will be covered with at least one spell, but some will be more represented than other. That being said, we can't actually be 100% sure which spells fit what classes, but the evidence is very strong in most cases, mainly in form of old spellbooks similar to the ones that are in the live and playable game. Here I will simply assume the obvious and take for granted that the books are correct. If one of the abilities is used in Classic WoW by any NPCs, I'll make sure to mention it. Often those NPCs will fit the archetype of the player class that the ability was originally meant for. Lastly, I want to point out that we can't be sure if Blizzard had real plans of implementing all of the abilities in today's video. Some have a very basic and simple design, and they might just have been used for testing or as placeholder skills. When I say in the video that so and so ability worked in this type of way or did this type of thing, I'm just referring to the database description of the spell and how it must have worked internally for Blizzard when testing it. I don't think most of the spells of the video even made it to the beta versions of the game. Now let's crack the list open and begin by looking at some removed crowd control spells. The first spell is the Mage Frost ability Chains of Ice. Chains of Ice worked like a single target freeze with a duration of 15 seconds, a 30-yard cast range, and a 1.5 second cast time at rank 1. It's a pretty neat CC ability that could be used in different scenarios in both PvE and PvP, similar to Polymorph to a degree. They can both serve the same purpose in some situations like CCing a melee mob in a dungeon, but Chains of Ice will only freeze or root the target, so it doesn't prevent spellcasting or the ability to auto-attack. The duration of the effect is also shorter than Polymorph. In that way, Polymorph definitely seems superior, but a benefit to Chains of Ice is that it doesn't break immediately if the target takes damage, and it doesn't heal the target either. If it counted as a freeze effect as well and synergized with a talent like Shatter, it could actually be great and fun to play around with. Like I said in the intro, some of the removed class abilities were still used in Vanilla or Classic, although not by players, and Chains of Ice is one of them. The fun thing is, all of the monsters that use it are mage-type NPCs with other mage abilities. 3 of them are found in the Dead Mines, and it reminds me of when some mage NPCs use a version of Arcane Explosion that has a cast time, because it used to work like that, and the improved Arcane Explosion talent would shorten the cast time and not increase crit chance. As a last note on Chains of Ice, it was later added to the Death Knight class in Wrath of the Lich King, but the effect was not the exact same. It would only slow the target, although it could be improved to work like a short freeze with a special talent back then. The visual effect was also changed and improved to be more fitting than the vanilla version. Blizzard didn't consider Chains of Ice as the only longer duration mage CC ability. There are old books that teach a sleep spell as well, to both mages and priests actually. It appears to have worked like the items Slumber Sand or Magic Dust, with the CC duration varying depending on the rank of the spell. You're putting the target to sleep, preventing it from doing anything. Anyone who has used one of those 2 items in a PvP or PvE scenario knows how powerful they can be, and they can be used on a wide range of different monster types unlike Polymorph. Still, I'm happy we ended up with the more balanced and iconic Polymorph in the end, and Priest got Shackle Undead. The sleep form of CC we got was Hibernate for Druids, which is more or less the sleep spell, except usable only on Beasts and Dragonkin. The idea of reusing the same CC spell for different classes is a bit boring, and Sleep might have been a placeholder ability, I'm not sure. I like the idea of different classes contributing with different forms of crowd control for different situations. Among NPC creatures in Classic, Sleep is used widely, but the duration is usually shorter than the original player version. The druids in the Veiling Caverns famously use a Sleep ability, and a boss like Twilight Lord Kelvis from Blackfathom Deeps does so too. It's a very common ability in that way, and well recognized unlike some of the ones coming up. We'll be moving on to some removed damaging abilities next, and the first one is the Warlock's Blood Boil. Blood Boil was a 3-second cast time spell that dealt fire damage. There are 3 ranks of the spell found in the databases, and the average damage dealt is 33.5, 86 and 155 for rank 1, 2 and 3 respectively. The range is the same as Shadow Bowl, but the cast time is pretty long even at level 6, which is the level requirement for the first book that teaches the spell. The mana cost here is admittedly lower for Blood Boil, but Shadow Bolt has a slightly higher DPS. They do seem to be balanced pretty equally if you compare them rank to rank, so the only real difference between the two is what type of magic damage they do. There's an obvious problem with Blood Boil however, which is what happens when you use it against a target like a mechanical unit or an elemental that has no blood. Bleed effects like Rend usually don't work against those types of creatures, so could you imagine if you had no Shadow Bolt and only Blood Boil but couldn't use it against Ragnaros, Baron Geddon and so on? I guess it wouldn't work on skeletons either, so half of Naxxramas would be a mess as well. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we didn't get to see Blood Boil in vanilla. No creatures use it either to my knowledge. It was actually added in another form in Wrath of the Lich King when Death Knights, once again, received an AoE spell with the same name, and here I think you can use that against any targets. Another ability very similar to Blood Boil is Molten Blast, originally intended for the Shaman class. I won't go into too much detail on it since it is basically just a Scorch or Searing Pain for Shamans with a little longer cast time. Unlike Blood Boil, Molten Blast is actually used in Classic by at least one NPC, Pyromancer Lorgrain in the Blackrock Depths. He's the guy who drops the formula for the Fury Weapon enchant. It's cool to see, because Lorgrain is a shaman that uses Searing Totems and Flame Shock as well, so his use of Molten Blast fits with his theme. Luckily for him, he got to keep the skill where we players didn't. We continue with some more shaman spells. First, the instant cast Lightning Shock. Lightning Shock was a shock spell similar to Earth Shock, but instead of interrupting spells, it would dispel a magical effect from the target like Purge. Purge is a very powerful ability on its own, and adding a damaging effect to it would clearly make it even stronger. The interesting part is that not only was Lightning Shock considered for the Shaman class, so too was its little brother, Shock. Shock is an instant ability like Lightning Shock, but with no additional effect outside of dealing nature damage. Very vanilla, no pun intended. Only Shock would end up making it to the live game, as far as I know, where it's used, among others, by the most powerful shaman of them all, Warchief Thrall. Thrall's version does somewhere around 22 and 2800 damage, so he's using a slightly buffed version. Personally, I actually like the design of Earth Shock and the other Shock abilities more, and I think Lightning Shock would have been too strong and too frustrating to play against had it been implemented. I think the current Shock system works nicely in Classic. We have another shocking ability coming up as we keep the theme of lightning going a little longer with Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm was yet another shaman ability that was robbed from the class, and it was modified for druids to use in form of Hurricane. There are some key differences between them, however. With Hurricane, there's an attack speed slow, and you choose the area of effect on the ground, whereas Lightning Storm has to have a target that the storm is placed above. At least that's how it works when I tested. Lightning Storm had a 3-second cast time and a 15-second long channel duration after that, where nearby enemies would take damage. I've always liked the visual effect of Hurricane with the dark clouds that emerge and the thunder, so it would have been cool to see shamans with their own Lightning Storm, although the design seems a bit clunky and unrefined. The spell is used in the game by different NPCs, but I think it's mostly under the name Lightning Cloud. Lightning Cloud doesn't need to be channeled, and some of the better versions don't have a cast time either, so it's slightly different. An example of its use can be seen in the Barons with the Kolkar Stormers that also have a lightning bolt ability. The next skill in line was very likely meant to be a hunter spell, and a quite special one at that. Not only did Blizzard consider focus instead of mana as the hunter's spell resource in Classic, apparently they played with the idea of reagents as well for the ability Explosive Shot. Explosive Shot was a 1-second cast time spell that would deal damage to a target and explode, also damaging nearby enemies at the cost of some mana and the reagent Explosive Shell. In the footage you're looking at from my test server, I'm not actually using the player version of the spell since it requires focus to use. When I try, I get the error message, not enough focus, which I thought was pretty interesting. I'm using a different NPC version of the spell, which I'll get to in a bit, so the visual effect might not be the right one, and the damage dealt is also not correct. To return to explosive shells shortly, they were created in stacks of 10 through a profession at the cost of 2 bronze bars and 2 pieces of coarse blasting powder according to the databases. Given the engineering logo on the spell that creates them and the use of blasting powder, I think it's safe to assume that they were intended for the engineering profession. Engineers can craft gun ammunition too, so it also makes sense in that regard. Although not implemented in vanilla for players, Explosive Shot was later added to the game for hunters to use in Wrath of the Lich King. The Wrath of the Lich King version of the skill wasn't very similar to the first one, but in Legion I think it was changed to resemble the original one more, the only notable difference being a delay in the explosion around the target as far as I can tell. From a gameplay perspective, I'm sure most hunter players wouldn't mind if they had gotten the ability in Classic. It would be a nice form of AoE to supplement volley, which is very subpar compared to other classes' AoE. I think Explosive Shot is one of those types of spells that have a strong design foundation, are intuitive and can hold up on their own. For that reason, I'm not sure why Blizzard waited so long to make it available. The spell I was using in the clip before is also called Explosive Shot, and it is used by the Doomforge Dragoons in BRD, but the effect is not the same as the player version. The NPC version works kind of like a fire damage multi-shot, so there's no AoE explosion. While we're at it and speaking about hunter spells, I want to quickly mention the removed ability Starburst, although it's not a damaging spell. Starburst was technically added to the game, you could argue, but under a different name, Flare. The effect seems to be the same with a slight difference in the wording that could be important, but Starburst had a 1-second cast time, and it also required an explosive shell to use, which I find interesting. Flare only has a mana cost, so even though Blizzard had the option to make explosive shell relevant, they decided not to. That was just a small tangent. Let's look at some removed buffs and debuffs next, starting with the pre-spell shadow word Fumble. Fumble was an instant cast spell that had the effect of reducing the target's chance to hit by 75% for 5 or 10 seconds depending on the rank. This exact effect is the nightmare of any melee class, and it is used under many different names by a lot of NPCs around Azeroth. It was featured in my worst mobs in Classic WoW video, where I mentioned the Elder Planestriders in Mulgore and Kolkar Drudges in Durotar that used Dust Cloud. Dust Cloud only reduces your chance to hit by 30%, but that's bad enough on its own. I was actually made aware by a viewer commenting that an even worse version exists in form of the ink spray used by marsh inkspewers in the Swamp of Sorrows. Ink spray reduces your chance to hit by 50% for 15 seconds, so that one can definitely compete with shadow word Fumble. I'm sure Fumble could be very useful for the priest class under certain circumstances, but I don't like the theme of the spell, and I don't think it fits with the class well. What do shadows have to do with fumbling anyways? You can't see anything because it's dark maybe? For whatever reason, I consider the effect an NPC effect, so to say. I dislike it as a player spell. Players didn't miss out on the effect entirely though, since the item Bag of Marbles still has it. Bag of Marbles is admittedly only available to Alliance players through the Elven Forest Quest Gold Dust Exchange, so you did technically miss out if you're Horde. All that aside, Bag of Marbles will decrease the target's chance to hit by 25% for 10 seconds, and it has 10 charges. The debuff you put on the target actually has the icon of shadow word Fumble and the name Fumble as well, which I find interesting. On the surface, Bag of Marbles might look pretty average, but it's actually very special. You can use it on raid bosses in MC, BWL and so on to reduce their chance to hit. At least that is the claim in a lot of old comments, and apparently it even worked in the Burning Crusade. I find it all incredible, and I'm amazed I haven't heard of it before. Maybe you can put the debuff on the boss, but it has no actual effect. I don't know. It seems a bit overpowered. I think Bag of Marbles actually used to be sellable on the auction house, but in Classic you can only get one per character, so the use is limited. You would still think you'd have heard of hardcore waiting guilds using them when clearing new content. If they work, I feel like it's a very powerful tool, and I also feel like the Alliance has a lot of overpowered quest rewards. First Light of Elune and now Bag of Marbles. We move on, and now for two spells that are so incredibly bad I think everyone can be happy they weren't added to the game. They both have the same base effect, but let's look at the worst one first, Spirit Armor. Spirit Armor was a shaman spell that would buff the armor of the target for 30 minutes like a Scroll of Protection, but the armor increase was significantly worse. The first rank of Spirit Armor increases the target's armor by 5. Yes, you get 5 more armor, and it doesn't get much better with the later ranks. Could you imagine going to your trainer excited to learn a new awesome spell just to find Spirit Armor waiting for you with its 5 armor increase? I wouldn't even want to spend money learning it, that's how useless it is. The trainers are trying to rip you off. I'm being a bit dramatic, and my guess would be that Spirit Armor was designed before the class designers had a real idea of how much armor items would have. The reason I can say with high certainty that it was meant to be a shaman spell, by the way, is because of the different wording in the 4th and 5th ranks of the spell, where it specifically says calls upon the spirits to defend the shaman's target. The other spell, similar to Spirit Armor, is called Holy Word Protect, and I think the name gives it away as an old priest spell. Holy Word Protect would also increase the armor of the target, working exactly like Spirit Armor, but it was slightly better. I don't know at what levels all the different ranks of the two spells were meant to be taught, but rank 1 of Holy Word Protect is exactly 4 times better than Spirit Armor rank 1, since it increases the target's armor by 20 instead of 5. Still not a lot, but compared to Spirit Armor, it's insane. I thought it was fun to mention those two spells, and it shows that Blizzard probably planned on making armor buffing class specific like intellect and stamina buffing is. Instead, they decided to transfer the effect to the scroll items. The last ability I've got for today is technically a buff, but it's a bit special. It's the druid's Play Dead. Play Dead is like Starburst, since we actually did get it but under a different name, Feign Death, and in this case for a different class, the Hunter. Play Dead was very likely intended as a cat form ability, since you have to be in cat form to use it when I tested. I think it's funny to think about how Feign Death might have ended up as a druid ability. If that change was made today, it would have huge implications. It would definitely take away a big part of the Hunter class, and it would be interesting to see how druids could utilize it instead. I haven't played a Hunter in Classic, so I don't know exactly how integral the skill is to the general kit, but the first thing that comes to mind is that you wouldn't be able to do solo tribute ones, for example, if you didn't have it, unless I'm mistaken. You would also have a lot more expensive repair bills for all those raid deaths that can't be avoided anymore. So maybe it would mean we'd see a lot of broke hunters. And that's not even touching on the PvP aspects, but I'll refrain from going on any more tangents now. That's it for today, guys. We have gone through many different types of old class skills that Blizzard decided not to make available to us players in the end. I'm glad they remade some of them, improved their design and introduced them in a different form under a different name like we see with Shock and Earth Shock or even Lightning Storm and Hurricane. On the other hand, I'm sad in a way we didn't see skills like Chains of Ice or Explosive Shot that I think have a very strong design foundation and could have been implemented well. One of the things I enjoy about looking at old removed class skills like those is speculating about their potential use and how they would have changed the gameplay of the classes they were meant for if they had been added. I also like them for the story they tell of the development of the game in a similar way to some of the quests in my outdated and confusing quests in Classic WoW video that tell about another aspect of the development process. There's still a lot we don't know about Vanilla or Classic World of Warcraft, both its history and the game we're playing, and I like being surprised and discovering new stuff. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care, everybody.